Okay. Welcome again to the ones who have been joining in these few minutes in which we'll give some few instructions. So now I would like to introduce our speaker. So we're very happy to have Dr. Inge Molenaar join us today. She's Associate Professor at Radboud University at the Behavioral Science Institute. Inge works centers around educational technology and personalized learning. She focuses on how data from online learning environments, apps, and games can help us understand how learning unfolds over time. Furthermore, her work focuses on how these insights can be translated to visual interfaces for students and teachers to optimize learning and teaching. Inge is also quite successful in terms of grants and awards. She has recently become a Jacobs Foundation Fellow, and she received an ERC starting grant to develop hybrid human AI regulation system. Today, Inge will talk about the concept of hybrid human AI regulation in more detail. She will talk about an example of such a hybrid human AI system concerning the development of learners' self-regulated learning skills within adaptive learning technologies. So I'm really excited for this talk. Thank you for being here. And Inge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for hosting this, and also to Solar for putting this together. I'm always very excited to get this group of people meet. We're currently in a lockdown in the Netherlands, so I am presenting from home. So apologies for dogs, children, and other things moving around the house in between. And I hope that the whole presentation will transfer smoothly through you. Today, I take this opportunity to talk to you about where learning analytics and artificial intelligence meet, and really talk about the concept of hybrid human AI regulation that we started to work on in my group approximately 1 year ago. What I will do is I will conceptualize artificial intelligence in relation to human learning, putting maybe some emphasis on the importance of humans in fact learning and what that means for the tasks that AI can take over in educational contexts. Then I will do some theoretical framing of the concept of hybrid human AI regulation. And I will talk a little bit more about the empirical underliers that we've been engaged in over the last few years. I will talk a little bit more about the measurements of SRL, specifically in the context of adaptive learning technologies and support mechanisms of self-regulated learning also within this context. And then that sort of boils down to the articulation of the concept of hybrid human AI regulation. And I really hope that within the next 30 minutes, I can take you on board with this concept. And I'm really excited to hear your questions about it at the end of the meeting. So if we think about artificial intelligence in the context of education, it's quite different than in many other application areas. And so in the context of the self-driving car, which is probably one of the hallmarks of artificial intelligence, it is very clear what artificial intelligence is going to contribute in this context. It's clearly going to offload driving, and that will not harm drivers in any particular way. It will allow us to spend a lot of time that we now spend driving, although during the pandemic, we haven't been driving that much anymore. But anyway, it will allow you to spend that time in a more effective and efficient way. And we're actually already trying to juggle this multitasking, as you can see in the picture above. So for many application areas, the role of artificial intelligence is to take over particular tasks from humans that are clearly performed better or at least equally well by a system at that point in time, and will allow us to do things that are more important to us. Now, if we transfer to the situation in education, that is quite different, because in education, although we're trying to optimize and support learning, we're definitely not offloading learning, because students will still need to continue to learn important concepts, understand important knowledge, and create important skills throughout their lives. So in that perspective, the application area of education, and specifically learning, is really profoundly different from many other application areas. And that makes it so important to have a broad dialogue about the role of artificial intelligence in education, and also specifically in supporting young learners. And that's the focus of this talk. Now, if we think about intelligent systems and adaptive learning systems, oftentimes what we see is that apart from optimizing learning, we're also quite often, in fact, offload the regulation of the learners. So the system helps learners to become more efficient by controlling and monitoring their learning activities in such a way that we create an optimized learning trajectory. But while doing that, we also take away the need for learners to actively monitor their own progress and to progressively control their own strategies and learning activities. So within that situation, together with optimizing learning, in fact, we might in some situations also offload critical processes for learning. And so the argumentation that I'm trying to lay out to you today is that apart from optimizing learning, we should also think very critically about which aspects of learning that we're offloading within the current scenarios, but also within future learning scenarios, and think about that transition. What does this mean for the actual learning process that students are engaged in? And that's where I like to make the proposition that we should try to onload regulation back to learners to make sure that learners engage in important self-regulatory activities for two reasons. One, because we know that self-regulation helps learners to create deep knowledge. So what you see if learners plan and orientate on learning activities themselves and steer these learning activities in a proactive manner, they're actually much more aware of the topics that they're learning and connecting that within their brain structures. So that results in deep learning, deep connections between existing knowledge, new knowledge that can be transferred to new situations and be applied in a multitude of different contexts. So deep learning is really important, and SRL really seems to have a very strong interaction with deep creation of knowledge. And at the same time, we expect these learners to continue to learn throughout their lives. Everywhere around the globe, we see that lifelong learning is a hot topic. It's important to give learners the capacity to, in fact, create lifelong trajectories of learning and relearning throughout different situations. And from that perspective, it's also really important to develop these self-regulatory skills to make sure that these learners are, in fact, capable of learning throughout their lives. So these are two really important arguments for supporting regulation within learning trajectories and learning contexts. One is the deep learning and two is the future learning argument in order to make sure that learners develop profound knowledge and also develop the capabilities and skills to be able to steer their learning throughout their lives. Now, in order to do that, we introduced the concept of hybrid human AI regulation. And in this concept, we really think about the optimization of the human role as well as the artificial intelligence role within learning contexts. So on the one hand, humans are good at specific things. For instance, creating creative problem solving, understanding concepts from different angles. And artificial intelligence is good at fastly processing data and making sure that data is in fact classified or organized in such a way that learners can understand that data quickly. Now, optimizing these two roles means that artificial intelligence can take away some of the load that it is engaged with monitoring and controlling your own learning. And so with understanding and using data while students are learning, we can create more insight into the learning process. And in fact, many adaptive learning technologies are already developing some kind of form of monitoring and control while they are executing their functions. And so that means that the artificial intelligence to some extent creates a model for learners on how to regulate their learning. Now, creating a back and forth fluctuation between the artificial intelligence and the human learner in order to create more insight into how the learning process is evolving, but specifically how they're controlling and monitoring that learning process will allow us to use hybrid human AI regulation as a construct to actually teach these important self-regulated learning skills. And that entails one aspect that's very critical of this concept, and that is the transfer of control between the artificial intelligence and the human learner in different situations according to the measured control and monitoring mechanisms that we see occurring in a learning scenario. And so the quest is to create a system that can measure the knowledge development of students, but also understands how students are controlling and monitoring their own learning process. And in that interaction can fluctuate the control between the human and the artificial intelligence in order to, on one hand, optimize learning, but also provide the opportunity for learners to develop these important skills. So that is the general idea of the hybrid human AI concept. Now we're trying to materialize that concept into an actual system that can do that and can work as a showcase for this idea. And we're doing that within the context of adaptive learning technologies that are used in the Netherlands for young learners in order to learn mathematics and grammar. And just to give you a little bit more of an idea of these technologies, in Dutch classrooms, you will probably see situations like this, where the teacher is providing instructions in front of the whiteboard with supportive information from the adaptive learning technology. And while students are working on the different exercises to learn particular constructs better, the exercises are optimized to the needs of the individual students using different algorithms to adjust exercises to the actual knowledge level or performance level of students. So what you see in this context is that part of the regulation is taken over by the adaptive learning technology, and part of the regulation still is in hands of the students. They still decide how much effort they put in, how hard they try in order to get these exercises done in an appropriate way. Now, at the same time, students receive direct feedback, the assignments are being adjusted, and teachers are provided with dashboards in order to see how students are developing over time. And an oftentimes complaint that we heard from students is why are teachers seeing exactly how we are performing over time, and why we as a student are not involved in these dashboards, and why do we not see an overview of how we are approaching our learning goals and how we are performing. So that has been one of the cues for us to start thinking about personalized dashboards in this situation, but also thinking about what this situation actually does for students' ability to learn and regulate their own learning. So that is the context in which we work to develop the first hybrid human AI system. Now, the theoretical framing of this construct is also reflected in the title of this talk. Of course, we have a theoretical grounding in self-regulated learning theory, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. There are some important learning analytics constructs that are being used within this framework. And of course, artificial intelligence plays a facilitating role in order to create these fluctuating boundaries between human and AI decision-making. Now, if we think about self-regulated learning, this is a widely shared construct theory about how humans regulate and control their learning. And oftentimes it is considered that human learning is grounded in so-called CAM processes. And these CAM processes reflect cognition, which are the processes related to creating knowledge and understanding knowledge. Metacognition, the ability to regulate your own learning, controlling and monitoring of learning processes. Motivation, which is really the controlling of effort and engagement. And emotion is the direct regulation of emotions that occur during learning. And the constructs, these four constructs together, these CAM processes, build up the construct of self-regulated learning and how learners actively regulate and control their learning. Now, if you dive a little bit deeper into a model that we use within this context, we use the COPES model that has been developed by Phil Winnie and Alison Hadwin and has evolved over time. And in that model, there is a clear distinction between either the internal regulation process, so really what the learner is doing by him or herself. And the external regulation process, the way that the context of the learning environment is interacting with the actual learner. And within this model, there are 4 different phases that are being distinguished. The first phase is the definition of tasks, orientation on the task that you're actually engaging in. What is it that I'm learning? The goal setting and planning task, in which you really try to enact goals and set goals for a particular learning episode. And in that, you're creating standards to understand how your current situation is related to your progress. Then you start to actually engage in the learning process. And in that situation, there's critical control and monitoring loop. And this control loop decides whether or not it's consisting of the monitoring, in which you can really observe how your learning is going. And you're trying to make cognitive evaluations in which you compare your products to your standards in order to see if you're actually making progress. Now, if that progress is going well, no control actions are needed. But if progress is not as much as you would expect small-scale changes, adaptations in the learning process in order to engage in more effective or profound learning activities. Now, this is all an internal circle, and of course, these external evaluations can help you to prompt that you need to enact control actions. And finally, there is the adaptation phase that is not so much within the execution phase, but at a larger scale after execution, where you realize that some of the aspects that you've been working on should or could have been done in a more effective or more profound way. So that is the theoretical model that we frame our work in. If we look at the learning analytics input, an important aspect is the distinction between extracted analytics and embedded analytics, in which the extracted analytics really form the dashboards or the information that the system is providing back to the learner in order to act on, so the actionable units that you give back to your learners. Whereas the embedded analytics are more the way that the algorithms and the artificial intelligence are producing or responding to the different data that students are generating. And this is the interaction that we're interested in hybrid human AI regulation. And of course, dashboards are a very important interface between the actual embedded and extracted analytics that we're talking about in this framework. And if we want to transfer regulation or agency over regulation, then of course, these dashboards really create that mirror in between. Now, in order to move towards the execution of hybrid AI regulation, there are a number of challenges that we need to engage in. One of the challenges is the actual measurement of self-regulation during learning, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And the second challenge is designing support, so designing these personalized dashboards that really drive that fluctuation of control in an effective way. So those are the first 2 challenges we need to tackle in order to construct the first system. And then, of course, there is the evaluation of effectiveness, both towards deep learning, which is a more short-term goal, and towards future learning, which is a more long-term goal addressing these self-regulated learning skills at large. So if I dive into the measurement of self-regulated learning during learning, we see that traditionally measurement of SRL has been done by self-report or by think aloud. So self-report is mostly prior or post, and think aloud is primarily during learning, but of course very labor intensive and difficult to analyze. Now, going forward, there has been much work around multimodal measurements of self-regulated learning, in which we use multiple data sources in order to measure SRL during learning, of which important ones are log files and keyboard and mouse movements, which have been integrated across the board. Ones that have been only incidentally investigated is physiological data and eye tracking, which of course can provide different levels of information in these data streams. And the more contextualized measurements, such as video and voice, which are increasingly used as well. An interesting aspect here is, of course, that with the increased movement and usage of AI, we can also integrate these different data streams in a much more profound way in our measurements. Now, in this particular project, we're going to keep it simple. And if you're interested in multimodal measurement of SRL, we have a number of different other projects, such as the Flora project and some other emotion projects, related projects that I'm happy to talk about in the end. But in this particular project, we use the log files from the adaptive learning technology, and we use the knowledge model that the adaptive learning technology is creating from students. So those are the two main ingredients to work with in this particular situation. Now, if we think about measurements, we've been doing some empirical work on measurements that has also been presented at LOC. So I'll go relatively quickly through these examples, just to give you some idea of where we stand and what we're working on today. We've been investigating moment-by-moment learning curves, which has been proposed by Ryan Baker previously. And they show the probability of a student learning at a particular practice opportunity for a particular skill. And this gives us a temporal idea of how students' learning is evolving over time. And that really gives you an insight in the knowledge development, but it can also give us interesting insights into how students control and monitor their learning. And previously, Ryan showed that there were 7 patterns that they found in the context of students learning in intelligent tutoring systems, and we reused this same algorithm within our context to see how that worked out. I'll really go quickly through this information. This sample was 95 students, and they've been working in a traditional setup that we use to test our instruments, in which there's a pre-test on knowledge. There's 4 lessons in which students engage with the adaptive learning technology. And then there's a post-test and a transfer test. And you will see this setup of this design of experiments and design studies pass through different examples that I'll show. What we found is that there were 4, and later on we actually found 5 different learning curves that were quite reoccurrent in this particular situation. One were immediate drops, in which there's a really quick immediate learning. Second one was immediate peaks, where there's an immediate learning peak early on during the learning episode. We found close multiple spikes, which indicates relatively quick but fluctuous or dynamic learning. And then you have separate multiple spikes, in which you see ongoing learning episodes throughout the learning of students. We looked at the associations with both accuracy, and we found that these different visual patterns indeed showed different levels of accuracy of students working with the system, which indicates that they were also giving an indication for control mechanisms that students were enacting during learning. And of course, we found, as Ryan already did, relations with pre and post tests of the different learning curves, which gave us more insight in what these curves in fact mean for learning, but also for regulation. And to give you an overview of that, we found that these immediate curves, so the ones that go down relatively quickly, show that students have low gain and high transfer. There's high accuracy. And if we look at that from a human AI regulation perspective, it's rather ineffective learning and ineffective regulation, because most of these students, in fact, already knew the skills that they were training on. If we look at immediate peaks, there's high gain, high transfer, relatively high accuracy. This indicates relatively efficient learning, but also quite efficient regulation from students on their own side. If we see close separate spikes, we see moderate gain and relatively high transfer, reduced accuracy, and there's moderate learning, but there's also challenges in regulation. And what is the interesting aspect, and I'll dive into that in a minute, is that once the adaptive learning algorithm is helping the learner monitor and control their learning activities, we see an improvement in the learning accuracy. And then for multiple separate spike, there's relatively moderate gain and low transfer, strong reduced accuracy, and reduced learning or ineffective regulation. And there you really see students struggling with the material and not being able, even with support of the system, to effectively regulate their learning. Now, going forward from this first study, we started to look at how these moment-by-moment curves actually map on the different phases within the classrooms. And as I just quickly introduced, classrooms using this system are typically using a guided practice instruction phase in which the teacher is providing instruction to the whole classroom. In this particular system that we're using at the time, they actually had a non-adaptive practice phase. So they were practicing with exercises that were the same for all students in the classroom. Then they would move to an adaptive practice phase in which the adaptive algorithm actually adjusts the difficulty of the problems to the needs of the student. And finally, there is a repeated adaptive practice. Now, if you take the phases of the lessons and put them underneath the curves, you can really see that transitions oftentimes occur also with transitions within different phases of that learning scenario that the system was embedded in. And that really gave us more insights into how students were learning in different phases using these, showing these different curves. And what you really see is that these immediate drops, they mostly already learned during pretest, they actually already knew it. Immediate drops, mostly immediate peak, mostly learned during guided practice, just during the instruction. Same for double spikes. And then we have these closed multiple spikes that mostly learn during either the instruction or during the non-adaptive practice. So this is still a group that is relatively well organized by themselves. And then the separated multiple spikes, you really see that students struggle in the first stages and not start to learn until they actually go into system regulation phases where the system is helping them to regulate their learning. So what we did with this is that we started to think about the support needs for different groups of students, showing different particular patterns, going from the self-regulation groups that actually does really well without support. And those are the students showing those immediate and drops and peaks. Then a group that is really well off with teacher regulation and seems to be able to regulate their own learning during practice phases quite effectively themselves. A group that really needs the system to help them monitor and control their learning and really does best in the adaptive learning mode. And then the advanced system regulation group that actually doesn't have enough support yet with the current adaptivity of the system. Now, this really gave us an idea of how we can visualize different groups and how we can measure within different learning contexts and situations the support need of students for support of their regulation. And that put us to the next phase. Going back to this phase for 1 second, although this really worked well, we are currently working on some new algorithms to detect this in a further, at a more detailed level as well. And we're developing new algorithms trying to understand the diversity of different learners during self-regulation, even in more detail. And stay tuned for presentations at LOC around this topic. So moving towards the support side of things, once we have measured self-regulated learning during learning in an effective way, and we're still making progress on that, we can also start translating that into support mechanisms that can help learners enact control and monitoring in a more profound way. And that this is really where that transfer of control and the fluctuation of decision-making is taking place in the hybrid human AI regulation concept. So if you're at the self-regulation level, we really presume that you're capable of initiating your own control and monitoring, and that the AI only observes and mirrors your regulation. Whereas if you're at the AI regulation level, where you really need a lot of support, the AI controls and monitors your regulation, makes you aware of what it's doing and raises awareness of the importance without really asking you to engage in that activity at that point in time. Now, there are two levels in between that we find particularly interesting, and we're trying to explore how to best instrument these levels. One is co-regulation, where the AI continues to monitor and control your learning, but tries to model that process to you as a learner so that you understand how the AI is trying to control and monitor your learning, and that you can learn from that model to start moving on to that next phase in shared regulation, where the monitoring is still done by the artificial intelligence, but the control is actually transferred in different stages to human learners in order for human learners to start enacting that control phase by themselves as well. And that's where the function of the dashboard sort of changes from modeling towards scaffolding the enactment of control. So you see that within these different activities, the AI is transferring from controlling, monitoring, and control towards really only observing the regulation. And in exactly the reverse order, humans are becoming aware of how the AI is supporting them towards actually being in control of the self-regulatory process themselves. And within that transition, that dashboard is really the transferring interface that helps you to move on through these different levels. Now, if we depict that within the model that I just already explained, you can see that there's, again, this internal and external level of regulation in the 4 phases that we talked about before. And within these different phases, we created different levels of personalized dashboards that help learners to, that provide support to learners at different stages. So during the task definition stage, it allows you to see the different tasks and learning goals in order to better understand what your tasks currently are for a particular lesson. It helps you with goal setting in a feed-forward movement where you actually indicate what your goals are for this particular lesson, but also for the repetition lesson. During execution, it provides you with an overview of how your progress is and different artifacts that help you understand how progress is related to your goals. And it also provides you with direct and explicit performance feedback in order to support the monitoring. So it really gives you explicit information about how you are doing, how your progress is taking form, so that you can actually engage in effective cognitive evaluations and then also start enacting control of different strategies or different activities. Now, this is the current version. And then at the end, for reflection, we also show the learning trajectories of learners in a simplified manner in order for them to think about how they can reenact their control and monitoring during the next phase of learning. Now, if we zoom into these different dashboards, this is the overview screen with the different tasks that we're going to work on. And remember, we did 3 lessons with 3 learning objectives and 1 repetition lesson. And this is the dashboard where they can set goals, the ultimate goal, the goal after 1 lesson, or the goal after the repetition lesson. So you really make that distinct for the different learning lessons and activities students engage in. Then this provides an overview, and this is too much to explain, but trust me, children understand the colors and the attributes in about 5 seconds. And this actually becomes the dialogue in a classroom. Do you already have your ball, or do you already have this particular color? And then these different learning path screens really show the trajectories and help students understand how their learning progressed over time and what are the moments that they could have changed their strategies or actions in order to have more effective or efficient trajectories. Within the classroom that looks like this, we chose for dual interfacing. So this is the traditional learning environment that they're working on. This is the adaptive technology that the schools work on a daily basis. We added a different dashboard because this is a in-between connection. So it's not integrated within the products, but within different API structures, we're actually creating the dashboard based on the data from this particular technology. And that allows us to flexibly adjust the dashboards based on the design criteria and insights that we get from the studies. So that is the situation that we do our research in. And then we see these different posters that are on the screen, and apologies, these are on Dutch, where students can actually see what the different attributes mean and also get actionable feedback on the different trajectories that they're looking at. Now, we also did a experiment getting more insights in how this interacts with students' regulation, monitoring accuracy, and learning. And I'll quickly go through the results as well to give you some ideas. Again, same setup as before, but now we have a control group and an experimental group. Same pre and post measures as I previously indicated. What we saw is that we found an effect on regulation of practice behavior. So what you see here underneath is that we have 3 different scales. That's important information, by the way. One that is relatively easy. So a lot of students in the class already know this. This is an intermediate skill. So this is really within the zone of proximal development. And this one is really difficult. So this is really putting children slightly under pressure to perform. And so regulation becomes more important in these later skills because that's when you really have to enact regulation during learning. So what you see is you don't really see an effect during the easy skill. You see an effect of the dashboards between the personalized visualization condition and the control condition for the intermediate and for the difficult skill. And then you really see that they transfer from less complex curves here in the experimental condition to more complex curves in the control condition, which really indicates that they are controlling their learning to a lesser extent in these particular situations. And if we look at learning outcomes, we see that it doesn't make a difference for the easy skill. It makes a significant difference for the intermediate skill, and it does not make a difference, or it does a marginal difference, so it does not make a difference for the difficult skill. So you really see an interaction, and we see that more often between the actual difficulty level, the relation with prior knowledge, and the effectiveness of SRL in different situations. So this aligns with the theoretical models that we have on the importance of SRL during learning. And then if we look at monitoring accuracy, and that test is how well students are capable of monitoring their own progress while they are learning, you see a quite interesting effect from where we see that the control condition is underestimating themselves more, whereas the personalized visualizations condition is underestimating themselves more compared to the control condition that is overestimating themselves more, and that is consistent across the different difficulty levels, although you see it more profoundly in the easier levels. So somehow through giving students much more information about their progress, they start to underestimate themselves more as opposed to overestimating, which is a general trend in young children. So we're really turning that around. Not necessarily sure if I'm totally happy with the fact that they start underestimating themselves, but it is positive that we're reducing overestimation. All right, so what I've done so far is give you some insights in the theoretical foundations that we built this hybrid human AI concept on. I gave you some empirical work that gives you the under layers of why we designed or started to think about a system like this. And now, of course, I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 more minutes about how we're going to move towards creating an actual first hybrid human AI regulation system. And that combines the different elements that I just talked about. So this one we already saw. We're envisioning 4 different levels at this point in time, degrees of AI regulation, intensities that can fluctuate over time, from AI regulation to self-regulations with different roles of artificial intelligence, different roles in increasingly more important role for humans, and with the dashboard as the interfacing mechanism to transfer from one level to the other. And that creates an overview like this, which I don't expect you to understand at sight, but it does give you a bit of an idea of what we're trying to do here. We have that COPES model on top with the different faces and the different interfaces that are created. What you saw me explain in the empirical data is the actual effects of this co-regulation phase, where we provide students with increased orientation planning and monitoring during learning and after learning. So that is the level that we already did an experimental study with, and we have some understanding of what it does for students' regulation. And so this level already helped us show that it can help practice the support of improve the actual regulation of practice behavior and that transition of monitoring accuracy. Now, what we're intending to develop is the level of AI regulation that is going to support learners that need more support than the system is currently giving. That's that group that showed that very spiky, difficult learning pattern. How can we develop an AI algorithm that actually taps in even more into their data in order to help them go through a more systematic learning process? Then we already developed a shared regulation version where, again, the monitoring facilities are included. But on top of that, we're also going to give students the ability to enact control. So to actually take action on the monitoring insights that they receive through the system and actually control difficulty levels of the problems that they're working on to increase the effectiveness of their learning curves, but also to give them a way to really interact with the system and indicate what their needs are and have that execution over control. We actually did a first design experiment with this, and it's really very interesting to see what choices students make when they get to choose what the difficulty level is that they like to work on and how that interacts with their actual performance during learning. And then finally, we will also want to develop that layer in which we only mirror what students are doing, but not so much enact control by the actual algorithm. So really provide much more space for students to self-regulate their learning. But that's definitely going to be the last step that we're going to take, developing this hybrid human AI regulation system. So to wrap it up, the central idea is that transition of control between one-sided the artificial intelligence that increasingly gains more intelligence over how students are learning, how they are controlling, and how they are monitoring their learning. And at the same time, translate that into dashboards that can help you grow from understanding, awareness, move towards modeling, shared control, and then ideally self-control. So really try to make that transition from external support to internal support and develop these self-regulated learning skills that students really need in order to create deep learning experiences, but also to support their learning for future learning and develop self-regulated learning skills to empower them as lifelong learners. So that is the idea of hybrid human AI regulation. I hope this gave you some insights of how we constructed the idea, the concept, and how we are currently working on developing that construct into a first example system within the context of adaptive learning technologies. I totally realized that some of the information may have gone a little bit fast. So if you like to read and sit and digest all the information, please consult the different papers that are out there and are here on this list. And if you have problems acquiring them, please reach out. We'll make sure that they'll be transferred to you. And important to note, of course, I'm not doing all this work by myself. I'm super happy to have the Adaptive Learning Lab supporting the work that we are doing. And this is just one of the many projects that we're doing in the lab, but it's probably one of the most profound ones that we're working on right now. So I'm really happy to share this. And I'm also really eager to get your questions, comments, and ideas about this. And before I hand the floor over back to you, Isabel and Kaisha, I want to do a quick call out for people that are wanting to come and work with us. We are looking for a postdoc with a strong background in artificial intelligence and a postdoc that is an educational wizard but understands data, learning, analytics, and AI. So if you're that person and you always wanted to come and work in the Netherlands, do send me an email and we can talk further about that. And this spring, we'll have 2 PhD positions opening, one in designing teacher dashboards for self-regulated learning based on this HHAIR work that I just presented, and another one that is going to look at measuring and supporting self-regulated learning and educational systems for secondary education. So at different stages of development, please reach out to us if you're interested to come and join us at the Adaptive Learning Lab. And that's it for now. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Inge, for this interesting discussion. It was really inspiring, very interesting to hear about the works and how AI can be aligned to learning analytics research. And you can see these topics are very much aligned together. It's a very good complement to the LA work that's going on. So I think this is very interesting. So I think we'll now open the floor to the audience for some questions. We have 12 minutes remaining, so we'll just ask kindly if someone has a question to be as brief as possible to ensure that we have enough people to ask and share some insights. So I think we have some questions in the chat, but we also have Jim and Bowen. So maybe we start with the question that is in the chat, and then we will come back to some people who are in the audience. Manish, you have a question. Do you want to unmute and ask, or do you want me to read out your question? Manish, are you there?
Please read out this.
Okay, so Manish is saying, how do you see this affecting dependability on HHAIR systems, and how can transfer be ensured so without HHAIR systems, people are able to work independently, which is what social self-regulated learning is about? Do you get that, Inge?
Yeah, I'm also looking at the chat to make sure that I get it right before I start answering a totally wrong question. And that's sort of helpful to have it written out as well. Yeah, that's a really good question. But I think the current situation is probably even worse on this, because what we see today is that oftentimes students learn to work in these adaptive learning technologies, and they're increasingly used throughout education, at least here in the Netherlands, even in secondary education as well. And if we continue to offload regulatory activities for students at a large scale, we take away the opportunity for them to build up SRL skills. So I agree that the HAIR system is a transfer, and it's supposed to transfer to self-regulation in the end. But we also know that students really need support, especially in primary, secondary education, but even also in higher education, to enact SRL, especially in complex situations. So that's where I think it's really important to develop these systems that start fluctuating the boundaries between artificial intelligence regulating and students regulating themselves, because that allows them to build these skills depending on the repertoire that they are showing in particular learning environments. So that means that they don't always are in a fully supported situation where they don't execute any regulation activities, that you really start looking at how they are evolving in particular learning context and adjust the need for regulatory support based on what you see from students developing. And I think that's a step forward from the situation that we are in today. I hope that makes sense, and please jump in if you want to follow up on that.
All right, so we'll just go a little bit to the audience. Jim, do you want to unmute and ask your question before we continue with the question in the chat?
Sure, yeah, I mentioned in the chat, I wondered about the slide. I don't know if you can share your screen again, please, Doctor. I would love to see that incremental step graph. It was color-coded, and it described the spikes and the other learning patterns that you observed. I wondered what the y-axis was. Is that just performance level or some other measurement?
Ooh. Yep, I'll try to reshare without leaving, because that's definitely not the idea. Just hit the wrong button. Let's see, this one you mean, right?
No, much earlier than that one. Maybe if you could show that slide sorter view again, I could
absolutely
tell you approximately. Yeah, down from there, and no, okay, it's on the bottom. It's in the middle on the. You just went okay in the middle on the second from the right. That one, yes. Not that one, but the one to the right of it.
This one.
29. 29.
Yep, we'll get there.
Thank you.
No worries. Yes. Whoa, it's hard today. Okay, here we are.
That's the one. What is the y-axis there?
It is the amount of time in the lesson. So it is the percentage of time that they spend in the different lessons. So it's for here is time 0, here is 100% of the lesson time over, and then you see how it evolves over time.
I mean the vertical axis?
The x-axis.
Oh, sorry, this one. These are the different curves. So here you have the immediate drop curve, the immediate spike curve, the double spike, close multiple spike, separate spike.
So when the graph steps up, is that an increase in performance, or is that just a phase transition to a different kind of practice?
It shows when the peaks occur during learning. So you have these spiky curves, and then this shows when the peaks occur in the different phases of the lesson. And those are the ones that are depicted here. So for an immediate drop, all of the spikes are even in pre-test, so not even before, they didn't even start learning yet. Whereas for double spikes, we see that most of the spikes occur during guided instruction, some during non-adaptive practice. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
So it really tells you how the phase of the lesson is related to the moment when peaks occur for different visual patterns.
Okay, sorry. Oh, sorry for the interruption. I hope you are done. I didn't interrupt you. So we have a question from John. John Benekti was asking, do you have any evidence as to whether self-regulated learning improvements transfer to learning on other tasks or in other environments?
That's a really good question, and there's lots of work being done on that question, on to what extent SRL skills transfer and under which conditions they transfer. And I think we don't know enough about that yet, and especially not in these complex iterations where we try to also support or fluctuate the level of external and internal support. So it's a really good question, and it's really important for the moment when we start transferring into the more longitudinal aspects of this this project, where we really start to look at how different support types on a longitudinal on the long-term affect student self-regulation and across different contexts. So that's definitely a question that we're going to address, but right now we know that they transfer to some extent, but the exact extent and context in which they transfer, we don't really know that much about yet.
Thank you. Briefly, we have 5 minutes. So I hope we can have these two people. Bowen, please.
Yes, hi. Yeah, thank you for such a great overview. I was wondering about the slide where you made some differentiation between the different types of self-regulated learning. I found a really interesting perspective. I never really thought about, the different levels of transparency and control in that perspective. And I was wondering, in terms of children, how much do you feel like they're cognitively able to sort of have systems in each one of these levels, if that makes sense? Like, I've only really thought of self-regulation in the university context and not so much with little kids. So I was just wondering, when can we actually start developing systems that sort of, get at the layers in between?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and we're only trying to explore that by developing this. And currently the age of children that we work with is around 10, 11, 12. So they're in this range where you have these emerging self-regulation skills where you can assume that they have basic planning and monitoring skills developing, but that that they're still going to increase in monitoring abilities relatively fast across the different age levels. So that question is a really good one. And right now it's kind of a big package of different steps and phases that we're supporting. And one of the things that we aim to do even already this year is trying to sort of pick that apart a little bit further and trying to have a look at how these different elements of what we're doing with these dashboards can really help learners at different levels of their self-regulation, and really try to see what are the most critical elements and what are the ones that are just sort of around that. It's been developed this way because we really feel that's a cycle that we're trying to support. So we're really trying to move forward in building that cyclical thinking of planning towards monitoring, towards control, but that also makes it a very large intervention. So it's a really good question, and I hope to shed some more light on that within the next half a year, maybe a year or so. So please check in back probably at the next lock. We should be able to show you some more on that.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, yeah. Before we maybe answer 1, 2 last questions, I just want to ask you kindly that would like you to give us some feedback on this webinar, so as well as any ideas you may have for the future episodes. So I just posted the link to the feedback form, so kindly takes just a one or two, just a minute to fill. So if you could give us some feedback, that would be really appreciated. So Samin, if you can ask your question briefly.
Thank you very much. Inga, I would just like you to elaborate a little bit about the personalized dashboards that you talked about. I would like to know what kind of information would these dashboards contain, and what kind of personalization are you looking at? If you could just let me know. How do students understand their own how can students be supported in understanding more about their own self-regulation processes?
I'm not sure if I got the full question completely, but you want to know what the personalized aspects of the dashboards are, am I correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so what we do is we use the data to get these learning curves, and then we standardize them to some extent, because we only show 5 different learning curve dashboards. But we do use the own data and the classification of that data in order to provide them with a personalized dashboard. So it's a personalization, but it is within different categories. And we chose to do that because we also need to explain teachers and learners what they're looking at. So if you use the exact personalization, so really their original data, it becomes too complex for learners to work with. Now, of course, it's an interesting question is if they grow older, we can increase the complexity of the visualization and actually go closer to what they are in fact seeing themselves and producing themselves. And that's one of these questions that we also really would like to address further. And also people working in higher education, I think it would be a really interesting challenge also to start seeing if you can use some of these mechanisms as well to create personalized dashboards that are even more personalized than ones that we are currently developing. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And maybe Inga, lastly, so just maybe quickly, Stephen is asking, if these AOA artificial intelligence approaches are used at primary and secondary level, what implications does this have for students once they go to the university?
All right, let's make a jump start on that. The distinction from this, if they use these systems today, if these systems start doing what we expect them to do, we help students develop their self-regulation skills in a more advanced manner than we do today. So ideally, we develop students that actually are capable of regulating and controlling their learning more effectively, and that should be visible also within the university level. But we're nowhere near that yet. We're only starting to explore the idea, the concept, and trying to understand how data can inform monitoring activities and also control activities for students, and using these dashboards as an interface in between. And with the context in which students learn becoming more complex across different layers of education, naturally these dashboards as well as the support mechanisms will become more complex as well. So it would be really interesting to see if this construct also works in higher education. And I think it will take at least another decade before we have students that have been working with this in primary, secondary education reaching our university. So we have some time to work on that question, but let's see.
Okay, well, I would like to thank Rogers that joined me here. And since we ran out of time, we will now close the webinar. A very big thank you to our presenter today. Please, virtual applauses to Dr. Inge Molenaar. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion. We kept track for some of the questions. And I hope this session was inspiring for you as it was for us. We will have we have webinars every 2 months. So the next webinar is set for February. We will announce more details soon in the Solar newsletter and through our social media. So please feel free to subscribe to the Solar newsletter through the Solar website. And of course, feel free to tell a friend or colleague about these webinars. We will share the recordings in our website as well as the materials. So thanks again, Dr. Inge Molenaar, and take care, every one of you, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Isabel and Rogers, for hosting. This was a great opportunity. And thanks everybody for your attention.